Hello! Today we're going to talk about the history of men's necktie. So today the necktie is mainly used for business or as an accessory for formal wear. This wasn't originally the case. It was originally used as practical and functional wear. So going back in history, the men would wear a neckerchief for work, warmth and to soak up the sweat to protect their collars. Archaeologists have found evidence of neckties, the tayet or tiet, known as the knot of Isis, the Egyptian goddess of magic, motherhood and healing, around the necks of mummies. There are neckties in the terracotta army, and these different styles of neckties depended on your rank. And in the 3rd century BCE, men would wrap their Adam's apple tightly to protect it. This is known as their source of strength. So, like every fashion we talk about, it all depends on your practicality ending up as a fashion, and then it gets connected with your wealth, status and hierarchy. So in what was known as the 30 Years' War, which was a war between 1618 and 48, all about wealth and power and religion, King Louis XIII hired Croatian mercenaries to help fight for the king's cause. The uniform of the Croats and the Serbian Hrvats had decorative neck scarves that differed on their military level. Around this time, men were wearing these very nice lace collars with a central tie called a jabot. This had all come after the Elizabethan neck ruff. And here is King Louis XIII in his very lovely jabot. But when he saw these Croats in these very fancy ties, he was enamoured with this very smart neckwear and how it closed the shirt neatly and classily. He was so enamoured with it that he adopted it for court wear. The word cravat comes from the derivation of the French word for Croat. And the fashion, of course, travelled on to England, then to Europe, where the word cravat became cravat. Now, earlier cravats were always a long piece of silk, cotton or lace just tied up at the neck. And in 1818, a prominent pamphlet was published called Neckclothitania, which detailed popular ways to tie your necktie and also which was appropriate for whatever event. Whether you needed just a jabot or a very beautiful cravat, or maybe if it wasn't so formal, just a bandana. And then at some point later on, the stock tie. And the Industrial Revolution changed life from a farming culture. And the rise of the middle classes and ordinary people could afford things like silk and cotton rather than the expensive handmade items that had been. And eventually the necktie was worn by all men. So let's take a look now at some styles of neckwear ties right back to the 17th century through to modern day. Here is an example of a 17th century gorgeous cravat with its very fancy bow tie. Here we have a very fancy white lace, silk or cotton bow tie cravat. So here, 1790s to 1830s is an example of what they called the Empire cravat or the silk bow tie cravat. Here we have early 1800s. It's a wraparound, very high neck called a stock tie. And here is a beautiful example of the wraparound and an oyster silk bow tie stock tie. So here, 1810s to 20s, this lovely stock tie with a jabot was called a mail coach or a waterfall tie. 1837 to 1901-ish, we have this lovely barrel knot tied cravat. Going on to the later 1800s, we have what was called a plastron knot. And this one here is known as the Ascot tie. This comes, of course, from the Ascot Heath horse racing. Formal wear in England for the royal enclosure. We have here what was called a Kelvin knot from the early 1900s right now through to the present day, and the same sort of date. This was an early bow tie. Now, as we get more modern, I don't really see the difference in some of these knots, but I'll tell you about them. This one here is supposedly known as the 4 in hand. In the 1930s, the Duke of Windsor, who was married to Wallis Simpson, of course, he was supposed to have created the Duke of Windsor full Windsor knot or half Windsor knot. I don't know the difference. In the 1940s, we had a bit of an Art Deco revival with what was known as the kipper tie. This is called a bolo tie or the Westerner. So we go to the 1950s now, and this was called the Continental Cross. And here we have another similar knot, but this was known as the Pratt tie knot or the Shelby knot. Okay, the revival in the late 60s to 70s of the kipper tie that went huge, and a revival of the old neckerchief tie. In the 80s, when colour was everything and nothing should match, here we have an example of a zany 80s style. The 90s saw paisleys and florals come into fashion. The 2000s early saw this lovely Trinity knot come about. And here is an example of the Trinity knot with what was known as the Eldridge knot. And this is known as a bloom knot, or the zipper knot, that you can replace any tie to whatever knot you prefer. And of course the already tied clip knot that makes things easy for you. This here is known as the breakaway tie. So if I've left any out, do let me know, won't you, if you've enjoyed this historical fashion story. Join me again next time. Till then, bye.